the confession and the shattered trust. I'll never forget the moment my world came crashing down. It was a quiet evening in the house, the kind where you're too tired to talk but too wired to sleep. The baby had finally drifted off, and we were sitting on the couch, half engaged in whatever show was playing on the TV. Everything seemed normal, or at least I thought it was. Then, out of nowhere, she turned to me, her face pale and her voice shaky, and said, "I need to tell you something." I knew instantly that whatever she was about to say, I wasn't going to like it. My stomach knotted up, my heart pounded a little harder, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that followed. "I cheated on you," she said, just like that. No preamble, no sugarcoating. She just dropped the bomb and sat there, waiting for my reaction. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. Cheated? She cheated on me? The words bounced around in my head, not quite sticking, as if they were in some foreign language I couldn't understand. She explained it all so calmly, as if she were telling me about some minor inconvenience, like she forgot to pick up milk on her way home. She told me that it happened a couple of months after we got married. It was with her ex, of course. The guy she swore was just a friend back when we first started dating. She claimed it wasn't even a big deal, just hand stuff. As if that made it any better. Like that little detail was supposed to somehow ease the sting of betrayal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, the mother of my child, was sitting here telling me that while we were supposed to be building our life together, she had been doing that with some guy who was supposed to be out of the picture. She told me all of this just 4 weeks after giving birth to our son. As if the timing couldn't be worse. As if she hadn't already wrecked me enough by dropping this on me now, when we had a newborn baby at home. But then came the real gut punch, the timeline. That's when I started to do the math in my head. She said it happened about 2 or 3 months into our marriage. That was early enough for me to start questioning everything. I looked at our son, my son, the child I had been pouring all my love into, and a cold dread crept over me. Was he even mine? I didn't say much that night. Couldn't. I was too stunned, too numb to form a coherent sentence. She kept talking, apologizing, saying it didn't mean anything, that it was a mistake, that it was in the past. But I wasn't really listening. I was stuck in my own head, playing back every moment of our marriage, wondering how I could have been so blind. That night, after she fell asleep, I got up and did something I never thought I'd have to do. I ordered a paternity test. She didn't know, of course. How could I tell her that? But I had to know. I couldn't live with this doubt gnawing at me. I couldn't look at my son without wondering if he was really mine, and it was tearing me apart inside. The test would arrive tomorrow, and I had no idea what I would do if it came back with the wrong answer. The next day, I tried to act normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. I kept looking at her, wondering who she really was. How long had she been lying to me? How many other secrets was she hiding? And what about the future? Could I ever trust her again? Could I even stay with her? The thought of leaving crossed my mind more than once, but it wasn't that simple. We had a child now. If it weren't for him, I would have walked out that door the second she told me what she did. But I couldn't abandon him, especially not if he was mine. And that's the thing, I still didn't know if he was mine. That test, the one I had ordered in secret, was the only thing keeping me from completely unraveling. It was supposed to arrive that day, and my stomach churned just thinking about it. When the package finally came, my hands shook as I opened it. I had never been so scared in my life. The instructions were simple enough. Just a quick swab, send it back, and wait for the results. But nothing about this felt simple. It felt like my entire life was hanging in the balance. If the results came back and he wasn't mine, I didn't know what I would do. Could I stay with her after that? Could I look at her, knowing that the life we had built together was based on a lie? She must have noticed the package, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she had a feeling, or maybe she was too wrapped up in her own guilt to pay attention. Either way, the silence between us grew heavier. The tension in the house was unbearable. I could barely stand to be in the same room as her, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. So I waited, feeling like a prisoner in my own home, trapped in this nightmare that I couldn't escape from. It wasn't just the cheating that haunted me. It was everything else that came with it. I had given up so much for her, so much of myself. I pushed myself to the edge, working long hours, saving every penny, making sure she had everything she wanted. I never complained. I never asked for anything in return. I bought her a car when she asked for one. We were planning to relocate across the country just so she could be closer to her family. Everything we did, every decision we made was for her. And for what? So she could turn around and do this to me? I had sacrificed my own happiness for hers. I put her needs before mine, thinking that's what a good husband was supposed to do. And now I felt like a fool. All those years, all that effort, and this is how she repaid me? I was furious, not just with her, but with myself for letting it get this far. I wanted to confront her. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask her how she could do this to me. But every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by the weight of it all. I kept thinking about our son. What kind of life would he have if we split up? What kind of father would I be if I couldn't even keep my own family together? That's when the depression started to creep in. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, like a shadow that stretched further and further into every corner of my mind. I started feeling worthless, like none of this mattered anymore. I loved her. God help me, I still loved her. But I also hated her with every fiber of my being. I hated that she had the power to hurt me like this, that she had torn apart everything we had built with one reckless mistake. And the worst part? Couldn't show it. I had to pretend like everything was fine, especially around the baby. I couldn't let him see me like this. I couldn't let anyone see me like this. I was stuck. Stuck between wanting to forgive her and wanting to run away from her. Stuck between the love I still had for her and the pain she had caused me. I started considering divorce more seriously. But then the reality of that hit me, too. If we got divorced, she'd likely get majority custody. She had no job, no way of supporting herself, and would end up living with her parents. But the courts would still side with her. That's how it always went, didn't it? The mother gets the child, and the father gets weekends, maybe. The thought of being just a weekend dad, only seeing my son every other week, made me sick. So I stayed. I stayed because I didn't see any other option. I stayed because leaving felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. I stayed because, for some reason, I still loved her even after everything she had done. But deep down, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in this limbo, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. I didn't know what the answer was yet, but I knew I had to find it, one way or another. The paternity test and the emotional chasm. The morning arrived with the same heaviness that had clung to me since her confession. It was like the air around me had thickened, making every breath feel labored. My wife was in the kitchen, feeding our son, smiling at him like nothing had changed. She acted as if the bomb she'd dropped a few weeks ago had simply dissipated, as if time alone would fix everything. Meanwhile, I couldn't even stand to look at her for more than a few seconds without the bitterness rising in my throat. The paternity test had come in the mail earlier that morning. I saw it sitting on the table, small and unassuming, yet it carried more weight than anything I'd ever held in my hands before. For the last 2 weeks, it had been all I could think about. Was he mine? I had obsessed over every tiny detail of my son's face, trying to find traces of myself in him. Did he have my eyes? My nose? Or was I just seeing what I wanted to see? I needed to know. I couldn't live with this doubt clawing at me every second of every day. But at the same time, I was terrified to open that envelope. What if the results weren't what I wanted them to be? What if everything I feared was true? I waited until my wife left the house. She had taken our son for a walk, trying to get him to settle down after a fussy morning. The second she was out the door, I reached for the envelope. My hands trembled as I tore it open, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The results were printed in plain black text, as cold and clinical as you'd expect. I scanned the paper, my eyes darting over the words until I found what I was looking for. 99.9% probability of paternity. He was mine. The relief hit me so hard, I actually had to sit down. My son, the only pure, innocent part of this entire mess, was mine. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding on to the fear that he wasn't. I'd spent every waking moment questioning, doubting, imagining the worst possible outcome. But now I knew the truth. And that should have been enough to make me feel whole again, right? But it wasn't. Even though my son was mine, the joy was fleeting. My stomach twisted with a different kind of anxiety, because now there was no clean escape. No way out. I couldn't leave. I couldn't walk away from my son. Not when he was my blood. That small, hopeful part of me that had secretly wished for an answer that would give me permission to walk out the door was gone. Now I was stuck, trapped in this marriage with a woman who had shattered me, with no clear way forward. I sat there in silence, staring at the paternity test as if it could somehow offer more answers than just cold data. But it didn't. It was just paper. I folded it up, tucked it into a drawer, and locked it away, along with everything I was feeling. I had to. I wasn't ready to deal with the full weight of it. I wasn't ready to talk to her about it, or to admit that I had even taken the test in the first place. She came home a little while later, carrying our son in one arm and a couple of grocery bags in the other. She greeted me with the same soft smile she always gave, but it felt wrong, felt false. I tried to smile back, but I could feel the tension between us like an invisible wall. She had no idea about the paternity test. She didn't know that I had spent the last few weeks questioning whether our son was even mine. And maybe that was for the best, because if she knew, I'm not sure she'd ever look at me the same way again. For days after that, I tried to act normal, to keep up the facade that everything was fine. But nothing was fine. How could it be? Every time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal all over again. It was like a permanent stain on our marriage that I couldn't wash away, no matter how hard I tried. I kept thinking back to what she had done, how she had cheated on me with her ex just months into our marriage, and how casually she had admitted it, like it was some mistake that I should forgive and forget. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. I wondered if she still thought about him, if she missed him. Had she been thinking about him when we were lying in bed together all those nights? Did she compare us? Was I just some safe fallback, the guy who would always be there to provide for her while she pined for someone else? I hated the questions, but I couldn't stop them. And the worst part was, she didn't seem to understand the depth of what she had done. She apologized, sure. She said it was a mistake, that it would never happen again, that she loved me and wanted to fix things. But there was this casualness to her, this unspoken expectation that I would just eventually get over it, that we would move past it and go back to being us. What she didn't understand was that there was no us anymore. Not the way it had been. She had broken something between us that could never be fully repaired. And now, every time I looked at her, I felt the resentment building. I felt trapped. She had taken away my choices, forced me into a corner where I had to stay, for our son. If it weren't for him, I knew I would have left already. I would have packed my things and never looked back. But now I had to stay. I had to pretend. I threw myself into work. If I wasn't at the office, I was working late at home, burying myself in spreadsheets and meetings, trying to escape the reality of my life. I told myself it was for her, for us, for our future. I was working harder than ever so we could afford to move across the country like she wanted, to be closer to her family. I convinced myself that if I just kept going, maybe things would eventually fall back into place. But that was a lie, and deep down I knew it. I started drinking more. Just a couple of glasses of whiskey at first, to take the edge off after a long day. But it wasn't long before a couple of glasses turned into half a bottle, and then a full bottle on the worst nights. It helped numb the pain. It helped me forget, at least for a little while. But the problem with drinking is that once the numbness wears off, the pain comes rushing back even stronger than before. And the nights were the worst. Lying next to her in bed, pretending to sleep, when all I could think about was her and him. It didn't matter how many times she said it was just hand stuff with her ex. I didn't believe her. My mind filled in the blanks, creating images that haunted me, images I couldn't push away no matter how hard I tried. I'd lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, the anger and sadness swirling together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The isolation was unbearable. I couldn't talk to her about it anymore. She shut me down every time I tried, and I couldn't talk to anyone else either. My friends didn't know the whole story, and I didn't want to burden them with it. What would they even say? Most of them would probably tell me to leave, but they didn't have a child to think about. They didn't understand the complexities of being tied to someone forever, even if that tie was made of anger and betrayal. That's when Rachel started coming around more often. Rachel had always been one of my wife's closest friends, so it wasn't unusual for her to drop by. But lately, she'd been visiting more frequently. She'd come over to help with the baby or bring over dinner if my wife was busy or feeling tired. At first, I didn't think much of it. Rachel was always sweet, always had a smile on her face, and was genuinely helpful, especially during those rough days when it felt like everything was falling apart. But then I started noticing things. The way she looked at me lingered just a little too long. The way her hand would rest on my arm for a second longer than necessary when she passed me something. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just projecting my own confusion and loneliness onto her. But the more it happened, the more I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me felt flattered, I won't lie. I was so starved for affection and attention that even a friendly glance from Rachel felt like a lifeline. And another part of me felt guilty for even thinking about it. Rachel was my wife's best friend, after all. There were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But those boundaries felt more and more blurry as the days passed, as my wife and I drifted further and further apart. Rachel was filling a void I didn't even realize had grown so deep. She listened when I talked, really listened, in a way my wife hadn't in a long time. She offered me sympathy, understanding, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. Maybe it was the whiskey talking, or maybe it was just the loneliness, but I felt myself being drawn to her. And then, one night, everything changed. Rachel's temptation. The night that changed everything started like any other. I had just gotten home from a long day at work, and the weight of the week was bearing down on me. My wife barely looked up from her phone when I walked in. She was sitting on the couch, our son next to her, both of them illuminated by the soft glow of the TV. It was a scene that should have been comforting, but all it did was remind me how far we'd drifted apart. She mumbled a quick "hey," but her attention was clearly elsewhere. I nodded in return, feeling that familiar wave of resentment bubbling up inside me. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could just sit there like nothing was wrong, like we weren't broken beyond repair. But I didn't. I swallowed it down like I always did, forcing myself to keep moving, to keep pretending. That's when the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there was Rachel, standing on the porch with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic smile. "I figured you could use a break," she said, her eyes soft as they met mine. There was something in her voice, in the way she lingered at the doorway, that told me this wasn't just a casual visit. Rachel had been coming over a lot more often lately. It started small. She'd pop by to help with the baby or bring us food when my wife was too tired to cook. But over time, I started noticing the shift. She wasn't just here to help anymore. She was here for me. She listened when I talked, really listened, unlike my wife who barely acknowledged my presence most days. Rachel asked me how I was doing, how I was holding up. Felt good to be noticed, to have someone care about how I was feeling. I didn't realize how much I had been craving that connection until it was right in front of me. And so I let her in. My wife barely glanced up when Rachel entered the room. They exchanged a few pleasantries, but the atmosphere was tense. It was always tense these days, like we were all tiptoeing around the giant elephant in the room. Rachel sat down on the opposite side of the couch, our son between them. I sat in the armchair, watching them from across the room, feeling the growing distance between me and the woman I was supposed to be spending my life with. After a while, my wife got up, muttering something about going to bed early. She kissed our son on the head, barely acknowledged me, and disappeared down the hallway. Rachel and I were left alone in the living room, the baby asleep in his bassinet, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She poured us both a glass of wine, her eyes lingering on mine as she handed me the glass. We didn't say much at first. We just sat there, sipping our wine, letting the silence settle between us. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. In fact, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. There was no tension, no expectation hanging over me. Just her and me, two people trying to make sense of the mess we'd found ourselves in. After a while, she broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "How are you really doing?" That question hit me harder than I expected. It had been so long since anyone had genuinely asked me how I was doing that I didn't even know how to answer. I opened my mouth to say I was fine, to brush it off like I always did, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel lost. Everything's just falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Rachel nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," she said. "But you're stronger than you think. You're doing everything you can for your son, and that's what matters." Her words were meant to comfort me, but they only made the weight on my chest heavier. I was doing everything for my son. I was sacrificing my happiness, my sanity, to make sure he had a stable home, even though the foundation of that home was crumbling beneath my feet. I knew I couldn't keep doing this forever, pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. But what choice did I have? I couldn't leave. I couldn't break apart his world just because mine was already shattered. The conversation drifted from there, touching on lighter topics, but the undercurrent of something unspoken lingered between us. I could feel it, and I could tell she felt it too. There was something building between us, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but it was there all the same. After a while, Rachel leaned back on the couch, stretching her legs out, her bare feet brushing against my knee as I sat in the armchair. It was a casual gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't sure I could stop. Rachel shifted, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. "You don't deserve this, you know?" she said, her voice low and steady. "You deserve to be happy." The way she said it, the way her eyes held mine, sent a shiver down my spine. There was an intensity in her gaze that I hadn't noticed before, a hunger that made my pulse quicken. I should have stopped it right there. I should have stood up, walked away, ended the conversation before it went any further. But I didn't, couldn't. I was too far gone. I set my glass down, barely noticing that my hands were trembling. Rachel's eyes never left mine as she shifted closer, her movements slow, deliberate. My heart was pounding in my chest, the air between us thick with tension. I knew what was happening, and I knew it was wrong, but I didn't care. Not anymore. And then, before I even realized what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't soft or tentative. It was hungry, filled with a kind of desperation that matched the storm raging inside me. For a second, I froze, my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop this before it went too far. But then something inside me snapped, and I kissed her back. I kissed her like I was drowning, like she was the only thing keeping me afloat in the storm of my life. All the anger, the frustration, the pain I had been carrying poured into that kiss. And in that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about the fallout. All I cared about was the way she made me feel, alive, wanted, needed. It was everything I had been missing for so long. The kiss deepened, and for a few blissful moments, the world around us disappeared. There was no broken marriage, no betrayal, no lies. Just her and me, two people lost in the chaos of their own lives, finding solace in each other. But as quickly as it had started, reality came crashing back down around me. I pulled away, my breath ragged, my heart racing. What the hell was I doing? Rachel sat back, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what we had just done hanging heavy between us. "I shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice hoarse, barely audible. The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut, but there was something else there too. Something darker, more twisted. Satisfaction. Revenge. For a brief moment, I had taken something back, something my wife had stolen from me with her betrayal. Rachel didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. And then, slowly, she stood up. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't mean to." But we both knew that was a lie. We both knew exactly what had happened, and why it had happened. And as she left, I was left sitting there in the dark, staring after her, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. For a brief moment, I had felt something I hadn't felt in months: control, power. But as the door clicked shut behind her, that feeling faded, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. What had I just done? What kind of mess had I just made? I sat there in the quiet house, my heart still pounding, my thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But one thing was clear: I couldn't take it back. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The guilt and the spiral. I sat in the silence of the house after Rachel left, the weight of what had just happened bearing down on me like a crushing force. The guilt hit me first, sharp and painful, twisting my insides. What had I done? I had crossed a line I never thought I would cross, a line that I had judged my wife so harshly for crossing herself. And now I was no better than her. The taste of Rachel's lips still lingered on mine, a reminder of the momentary escape I'd found in her arms. But it wasn't just an escape. It was something more, something darker. It was revenge. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I had felt like I had some control over my life again. I had taken something back, something my wife had taken from me when she betrayed me with her ex. But as satisfying as it had felt in the moment, the guilt now washed over me like a tidal wave, threatening to drown me. I couldn't sit still. I paced around the living room, running my hands through my hair, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, and the more I thought about it, the worse I felt. How could I have let it go that far? How could I have let Rachel kiss me? How could I have kissed her back? I glanced at the hallway, where my wife and son were sleeping. The guilt twisted inside me again. They had no idea what I had just done, and the thought of them finding out made me sick. My son, the one reason I had stayed, the reason I had endured all this pain, was asleep in the next room, and I had just betrayed him. I had betrayed my family, and for what? A fleeting moment of feeling alive again? I poured myself a glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp, hoping the burn would distract me from the storm of emotions swirling inside me. But it didn't. It only made things worse. I poured another glass, then another, until the edges of my thoughts began to blur. But no matter how much I drank, I couldn't escape the reality of what I had done. I thought about my wife. She was no angel. She had betrayed me first. But now we were even, weren't we? I had just leveled the playing field. She had cheated on me, and now I had done the same to her. But that thought didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it left me feeling hollow. This wasn't supposed to be how it went. I wasn't supposed to stoop to her level. I was supposed to be the better person, wasn't I? I lost count of how many drinks I had by the time I collapsed on the couch, the alcohol dulling my senses just enough to keep the crushing guilt at bay. I stared at the ceiling, the room spinning slightly, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I tell her? Should I confess what had happened with Rachel? Would it even make a difference at this point? Part of me wanted to confess, to throw it in her face like she had thrown her affair in mine. Maybe then she'd understand the pain she had caused me. Maybe then she'd feel what I had felt all these weeks. Betrayed, humiliated, heartbroken. But another part of me wanted to keep it a secret, to bury it deep inside and pretend it never happened. After all, what good would it do to bring it up now? We were already broken. This would only shatter us further. I eventually passed out on the couch, the whiskey numbing my thoughts until everything went dark. But even in sleep, there was no escape. My dreams were filled with fragments of the night, flashes of Rachel's face, her lips on mine, and the crushing guilt that followed. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and the sickening realization that last night hadn't been a dream. I had really kissed Rachel. I had really betrayed my wife. My stomach churned, and I dragged myself off the couch, groaning as the pounding in my head intensified. I stumbled into the kitchen, where my wife was already up, feeding our son breakfast. She barely glanced at me as I walked in, her attention focused on the baby, but I could feel her coldness. Things had been tense between us ever since her confession, and last night's kiss with Rachel had only deepened the emotional chasm between us. Though she didn't even know it. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone indifferent. I nodded, unable to form a coherent response. My mouth felt dry, and my head was throbbing. I grabbed a glass of water and downed it in one go, avoiding eye contact with her. Couldn't look at her. Not after what I'd done. She didn't press me for details, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to talk, and even if I was, I didn't know what I would say. The guilt gnawed at me, but I swallowed it down, trying to act normal. I couldn't afford to crack, not now. I had to keep it together for our son, if for no one else. I went through the motions of the day, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was a mess. I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, not just about the kiss, but about what it meant. What did it mean for my marriage? For the mess we were already in? I hadn't planned on anything happening with Rachel. It had just happened. But now that it had, I couldn't ignore the shift inside me. For the first time in weeks, I had felt something other than anger and sadness. I had felt wanted. I had felt alive. But those feelings came at a cost, and the guilt was eating me alive. Rachel didn't text me, and I didn't text her. We both knew we had crossed a line, and neither of us seemed eager to acknowledge it. But it wasn't long before we saw each other again. A few days later, my wife had to take the baby to a doctor's appointment, and I was home alone. I hadn't expected to see Rachel, but there she was, standing at my door again. This time, she didn't bring wine. She didn't bring anything. She just stood there, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to figure out what came next. I wasn't sure if I should come by," she said, her voice uncertain. "But I wanted to make sure you were okay." I stared at her for a moment, the memory of our kiss flashing through my mind. I should have told her to leave. I should have shut the door, ended whatever was happening between us before it went any further. But instead, I stepped aside and let her in. We sat down in the living room, the tension between us thick, the air charged with unspoken words. Rachel looked at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry," she said after a long silence. "I didn't mean for things to get complicated." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? I was just as responsible as she was. If anything, I was more responsible. I had let it happen. I had kissed her back. "It's not your fault," I said finally, my voice hoarse. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen." The admission felt like a weight being lifted off my chest, but it also made the guilt hit harder. Saying it out loud made it real, and now there was no going back. Rachel looked at me, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "I think we're both just lost," she said quietly. "You're hurting. I'm hurting. And last night, it just happened." I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. She was right. We were both lost, both searching for something in the mess of our lives. But that didn't make it right. That didn't change the fact that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels so broken." Rachel leaned forward, her hand resting on mine, and for a moment, I let myself feel the warmth of her touch. It was comforting even though it was wrong. I knew I shouldn't be letting this happen, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said softly. "Just take it one day at a time." I nodded, though her words offered little comfort. I didn't know what to do with the mess I had made. I didn't know how to fix what was broken, and I wasn't sure if I even could. But in that moment, with Rachel sitting next to me, her hand on mine, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe we were both lost, but at least we weren't alone. For now, that was enough. The reckoning. The days after Rachel's last visit blurred together into a haze of guilt, confusion, and isolation. I was living in a limbo of my own making, caught between the crumbling remains of my marriage and the emotional escape I found in Rachel. I hadn't seen her since that day, though the memory of her touch still lingered in my mind, bringing with it a mix of comfort and regret. I had been avoiding my wife more than usual. She noticed, of course, but didn't push. I think we were both pretending everything was fine, clinging to the illusion of normalcy for the sake of our son. But we both knew better. Our marriage was a dying thing, and we were just biding our time before it finally collapsed under the weight of everything unsaid. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came crashing down. I had just put our son down for a nap and was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching. My mind was elsewhere, stuck in the endless loop of what-ifs that had become my daily routine. What if I had never found out about her affair? What if I had never kissed Rachel? What if none of this had ever happened? I was lost in those thoughts when my wife came into the room, her face pale and tense. I could tell immediately that something was wrong. She stood there in the doorway for a moment, hesitating, before finally speaking. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quieter than usual. My stomach dropped. Those 4 words never meant anything good, especially not now. "What's going on?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She didn't sit down. She stayed standing, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her eyes avoiding mine. "I know," she said, her voice tight. A cold chill ran down my spine. "You know what?" She hesitated, and then she finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I know about Rachel." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the ground shifting beneath me. How did she know? I hadn't told anyone, and Rachel and I hadn't even spoken about it since that night. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this had happened, but I couldn't focus. All I could see was the look on her face. A mixture of hurt, anger, and something else, something darker. How do you know?" I stammered, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "It wasn't that hard to figure out. You've been acting strange for weeks. And then I saw the way Rachel looks at you, how she's always around." I confronted her. She told me everything. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Rachel had told her. Couldn't believe it. My mind reeled. A storm of emotions hitting me all at once. Betrayal, guilt, anger. But most of all, fear. The secret I had been holding on to, the one thing that I thought I could keep hidden, was now out in the open, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It just happened." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Oh, don't give me that. It just happened? That's what you're going with? After everything I've done, after everything I've confessed to you, you repay me by screwing around with my best friend." I flinched at her words, the guilt crushing me even more. She was right. I had no defense. I had become the thing I despised, the very thing I had hated her for being. "I'm sorry," I said, but the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. Her face twisted in anger, but there was something else in her eyes too, something that scared me more than the anger. "You think an apology is going to fix this?" she snapped. "Do you think that's going to make it all better?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she cut me off. "You know what the worst part is?" I stayed. After everything I did, after I cheated, I stayed. I chose you. I chose our family, even though I knew you'd never forgive me. But you couldn't even do that. You couldn't stay loyal. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no answer, no defense. She was right. I had failed. "And now," she continued, her voice shaking, "now we're both stuck in this miserable marriage, pretending we're still the people we were when we got married. But we're not. We're broken, and no amount of pretending is going to change that." I felt the tears prick at my eyes, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes locked onto mine, searching for something. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "I think we need to end this." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I had known this was coming. I had felt it in the way we moved around each other, in the way we avoided real conversations, in the way we pretended everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. but hearing her say it out loud made it real. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. She nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm sure." And just like that, it was over. The marriage that had once been my whole world was now a pile of rubble, and there was no salvaging it. We both knew it. We had both tried to fix it, tried to stay for the sake of our son. But in the end, the damage was too deep, too permanent. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal papers, custody discussions, and the slow, painful process of untangling our lives from each other's. We agreed on joint custody of our son, both of us determined to do what was best for him, even though we couldn't make it work as a couple. In a strange way, that was the one thing we could still agree on. He deserved better than this mess we had made. But there was something else too, something unexpected. As the dust settled and the initial pain of separation began to fade, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. For so long, I had been trapped in the cycle of anger, guilt, and betrayal. I had been trying to hold on to something that was already gone, trying to make it work for the sake of a child who deserved better. But now, with the finality of our decision, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The weight of everything, the affair, the paternity doubts, the kiss with Rachel, began to lift. I was no longer living in the shadow of my own mistakes. It wasn't easy. I still had days where the guilt and sadness crept back in, where I wondered if things could have turned out differently. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. I was learning to live with the choices I had made, to accept that my life had taken a turn I never expected. And in that acceptance, I found peace. Rachel moved away shortly after everything came out. I never saw her again, and to be honest, I didn't want to. Our kiss had been a mistake, born out of pain and confusion, and I didn't need a reminder of that chapter of my life. My focus was on my son now, on being the best father I could be for him. One night, months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in my son's room, watching him sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet I hadn't known in years. And in that stillness, I realized something. I wasn't broken anymore. Sure, I had scars, deep ones, but I was still standing. And as I watched my son's chest rise and fall with each breath, I knew that despite everything, I had come out the other side stronger. Maybe not in the way I had imagined, but stronger nonetheless. Life didn't always turn out the way you planned. But sometimes that wasn't such a bad thing. And just like that, my chapter with her had closed. Unexpected, painful, but strangely beautiful in its own way. The beginning of something new.